On April 2nd, 1993, inside a crowded courtroom in Sonora, California, during a preliminary hearing, a mother reached into her purse and pulled out a .25 caliber pistol. She fired multiple shots at the defendant. Her target was 35-year-old Daniel Mark Driver, apparently a family friend. Within seconds, this incident launched the small, quiet town in Tulum County, California, into a frenzy, becoming one of the most controversial acts of vigilante justice in American history. This is the story of Ellie Nesler. Hello. You're listening to ShadeCore. This is a true crime podcast where we discuss all things shady and dark history as well as scandal. Happy belated Mother's Day to any mothers listening out there. I had a story planned for you that I'm going to talk about today. I originally wanted it to be covered before Mother's Day and released before Mother's Day. So I apologize. I had a wedding to go to. This is what I wore to the wedding. It's very Mormon wives coded. I always try to do weekly shows, weekly episodes, but it didn't work out. And at least it's still May, right? It's not June yet. So it's still Mother's Month. If you could, please, I would appreciate if you could click the subscribe button. I'm still very much doing this for free, and I would be doing that anyway because I love covering true crime and these stories and, interacting, building with you guys to have my own little true crime community out here. And before we begin, I want to give a disclaimer that this episode covers CA, SA, brief mentions of SI, addiction, violence, RAPE. So if these are not things you want to talk about today, very understandable. Please take some time, be your biggest advocate, enjoy some sunlight, listen to music you love, and I will catch you in the next episode. This episode is not intended to glorify violence or vigilantism in any way. My goal is to explore extreme cases of grief, rage, trauma, and suffering, and the ways these emotions can collide with society, the justice system, and public opinion. So with that said, let's get started. This is the story of Ellie Nesler, the courthouse vigilante mother. Elena Nesler was born on August 2nd, 1952 in San Andreas, California, located roughly 67 miles southeast of Sacramento. But all the territories I'm going to name today, if you're not familiar with the West Coast, California, or even the United States, Sacramento, Sonora, Jamestown, Tulum County, these are all regions known as kind of mining towns because between the 1840s and 1850s, people came from all over the United States to migrate here in hopes of getting rich during the gold rush. They wanted to get their hands on some gold, honey. And obviously this case takes place over a century later. We're in the 80s through the 90s now, but it still is a big part of that community, as you'll see later. And now you know some geography. Cool. So Ellie was the oldest of three daughters. I'm going to call her Ellie. That's what everyone called her, but her real name is Elena Starr Nesler. So she was the oldest of three daughters, raised in the hill country area around Jamestown, California. Her sisters' names were Marietta and Jan. Later, they would be known as Marietta Adams and Jan Martinez. Their father was a coal miner, and their mother, Marie Starr, I couldn't find if she was a homekeeper or she worked a job or if she was also in some kind of mining, but I think it was normal for women to be stay-at-home moms back then. I just don't want to assume. Ellie was a tomboy. So she grew up in the countryside of California. She knew how to drive a tractor, take care of animals. She was called a tomboy by her sisters, things like that. And growing up in her later years, she would later meet a man. And unfortunately, I don't know his name. He's not really relevant to the story, except that he's going to be her baby daddy. So these two were both hoping to strike it big as a mining couple. And I didn't know this, but in Liberia, Africa, mining is a cornerstone of Liberia's economy, contributing significantly to its GDP through the extraction of iron ore, gold, and diamonds. So Ellie and her baby daddy, or soon-to-be baby daddy, they're both into mining. They grew up in the mining part of California, and they decided to move to Liberia, Africa in hopes of striking it big, making some money. And they had already had a son together by the name of William. So they take little Willie and they move to Liberia, Africa. There they would give birth to their daughter, Rebecca. Sadly, the couple ended up breaking up Ellie decided to return to California to be closer to her family with her 2 children, Willie and Rebecca. And that's the last we hear about baby daddy. So he's kind of a deadbeat dad. I mean, he is a deadbeat dad, clearly. He's not in the rest of the story, which is annoying in its own way because I feel like single moms always take the brunt of what society has to say about their mothering, which we'll see in this case. And the dad's just nowhere in the picture. He's like, peace out, y'all. And that's what he did. So why is it that this single mother who cares about her 2 kids and she's a family oriented woman, why is it that later, flash forward 1993, inside a crowded courtroom, she would reach into her purse and shoot another man? Well, the story went like this. 5 years ago, back in 1988, when Ellie's son, William, who again I'll be calling Willie, was 7 years old, he went to a Christian summer camp. And Ellie normally never wanted her son to be going to some camp, but Ellie's sister Jan, all her kids went to the summer camp, and so Ellie was convinced it was safe. So Willie attended a Christian summer camp at the age of 7, and after he returned home from camp that summer, family members noticed that he was acting different. He was acting strange, depressed. A once playful young boy didn't really seem interested. He had turned more inward, and he was just depressed. Months would pass. A whole year almost would go by, though, until the family would learn Willie's truth, what had happened to him at summer camp. And this secret would shock the nation and rip this family apart. During a sleepover with his cousins at Aunt Jan's house, Willie told his Aunt Jan that a man named Danny did nasty things to him. When Jan dug deeper, she realized that the man he was referring to as Danny was none other than their family friend, Daniel Mark Driver. He was a family friend that had become acquainted with the Nesler family through her and her late husband through a Christian camp near Pine Crest, which is this national forest up in Tulum County, California. Before this was all revealed, Aunt Jan had trusted Daniel Driver as this good Christian man who carried a Bible everywhere he went, which I think is kind of weird, but okay. He was working at the camp as a dishwasher, and Willie told Jan everything. This man had sodomized him, and apparently he also told Willie that if Willie told anybody, he would harm his sister, his Aunt Jan, his mom, his whole entire family, which is why Willie was so scared to tell anybody for those months after the camp ended. So learning all of this, that Daniel Driver had essayed her nephew, she went to Ellie, Willie's mom, and they went to the police to report this. Sadly, again, nobody had suspected Driver of being this creep freak essayer. They had all trusted him because he had been like best friends with Aunt Jan's late husband. And the only person that kind of thought there was something off about Daniel was the matriarch of the family, Marie Starr, which is Aunt Jan and Ellie's mom. She said from the moment she met Driver, she felt something was off about that man, but she couldn't put a finger on it. She couldn't figure out what it was. And Aunt Jan was like, what are you talking about? He's my husband's best friend. He carries a Bible everywhere. He's good with kids. So Marie Starr had just let it go. And it just sucks because you always want to trust your instincts. But some of us, like, especially if you're a crime junkie like me, it's like, if I trusted my instinct everywhere I went, like, I wouldn't talk to anybody, you know? So by May 1989, a complaint was filed against Driver. And this complaint not only involved what Driver had done to Willie, in fact, complaints were piling up. Driver was not a first-time offender. It was alleging that 7 counts of child molestation involving 4 boys, including Willie, had been filed. And by then, Driver had fled, so he was not arrested until much, much later in late 1992 or early 1993. So you can imagine how infuriating this was for the Nesler family, especially Ellie, Willie's mom, because her son was essayed in 1988, and that's a span of approximately 5 years until Driver is arrested. This guy is just out in the free world, roaming around, doing as he pleases. Now it's 1993. Now they're in the courtroom. Ellie had spent weeks, grueling months, years, 5 years, watching this legal process crawl at snail-like pace as allegations against Daniel Driver had piled up, the man who allegedly sodomized her son and 3 other boys. And okay, to make matters worse, there were a number of other things that made this matter worse, okay? So this was just a preliminary hearing. So it's not even an official trial. The preliminary hearing is just to see if there's enough evidence against Driver to take him to court. So it's not even official that he's going to get convicted or charged with anything yet. And to make matters worse, it was brought up during the preliminary hearing that he had child molestation charges from as early as 1983. So that's 5 years before he allegedly essayed Willie. And it's already been a decade. Now they're at this preliminary hearing, and it's like he was already convicted before. So something I want you listeners to know is that, in case you don't know, is that at this time, there was no law requiring that people have access to a child offenders list. There was no registry list for offenders. That didn't happen until 1996 when Megan's Law passed, because a young girl by the name of Megan Conca had been RAP'd and unalived by an offender that lived across the street from her family in New Jersey. So when that happened, her family had to fight for Megan's Law to be passed so that the public could have access to this child offenders registry list. So there was no list at this time. And that is why this is so upsetting as well. I mean, these things still happen today, but there was no way for them to have known Driver's history because it wasn't available to the public. And that's upsetting because there's this feeling that something could have been done differently. So as it turned out, in 1983, Driver had pled guilty to lewd and lascivious conduct back in San Jose, California, involving 2 boys ages 8 and 10. So for those of you who don't know, lewd and lascivious is a legal term referring to obscene behavior with lustful or sexual intent, and it can include sexual acts in public or in the presence of someone without their consent. And it's for the sexual arousal or humiliation of the other person to gratify the perpetrator. And I don't think that he should have been convicted with. And I believe that I'm sure there were more offenders because this guy's been out there for a decade at least doing this to young boys. There's got to be more victims, in my opinion, but they just weren't able to take the stand or go out and convict him. And you can't really blame them because look at how easy he got off and how much trauma people have to go through just to testify. So I do suspect there are more victims, and this part is going to piss you off. So for his first conviction in 1983, Driver got off very easy. He was sentenced to 150 days in jail. He was fined $750 and placed on probation. And it's like, what? How did he get off this easy? So the report filed in 1983 in Santa Clara County Superior Court concluded that Driver could benefit from psychotherapy, no shit, among other things. And he should be considered for probation because the judge who was working on this case received numerous letters from members of Driver's church vouching for his character. And that's just reminds me of how, you always have these people hiding themselves behind churches, community groups. We see it in the Boy Scouts and we see it in different religious organizations. And I am all for, having a religious community, having other people that build and uplift each other. But I'm not saying anything about these institutions. What I'm saying is that these predators and these monsters can at times live among us in plain sight and carry themselves as upstanding citizens because the people around them are God-fearing, God-loving, or they want to believe that everyone around them is an upstanding community member that cares about their kids. But that's not the case. That's not always the case. So it is important to trust your intuition in these situations. And it's sometimes very hard to know who's a monster and who's not. And yeah, there was a doctor who was appointed to evaluate Driver after he pled guilty. It's why not before? But whatever. Dr. Charles Casella later gave an interview to the Sacramento Bee. And I don't know how this is not breaking HIPAA, but it was the 80s. And Dr. Casella stated, Driver seemed to be a self-sacrificing, eager to please individual, but his expectations of gratification in return caused a great deal of unconscious anger. And this next part is really disturbing, okay? Because Casella elaborates that Driver blamed one of his victim's mothers for his own actions of essaying her son. saying that he had this outburst of anger towards the mother of his victim because when he was trying to date her, she instead began to take advantage of him as her child's babysitter. So to deal with his outburst of anger, he essayed her son. And then he completely denied molesting the other child that he had pled guilty to in that 1983 conviction. So this just goes to show how this guy got a slap on the wrist and he really had no remorse. And what's more disturbing is that Casella added, I mean, I don't think it's more disturbing, but it's additionally disturbing. Casella stated that Driver smiled continuously during the interview, readily but superficially to what was happening, and he suggested that Driver's smile was the only evidence of his emotion. So that's just really creepy because it just makes me feel like you're talking to this sociopath. I'm not a psychiatrist, but this person has no emotion about what he did. And he just smiles because in society, he interprets his smiling as a way to relate to others. So he's really just trying to mask the fact that he's a monster and has no emotion or remorse about what he did to these children. And this smile bites him in the ass later. So at the courtroom preliminary hearing where Ellie and Willie were, Ellie was getting really, really pissed off, understandably. A mother who had just testified went up to Ellie and said, my testimony didn't go that well. I think he's going to get off easy regarding Driver. Not only that, Willie was supposed to take the stand last because apparently he had experienced the worst essay. He had been sodomized by Driver. So they were saving his testimony for last. And little Willie was not doing well. He was crying. He was shaking. He was telling his mom, I don't want to go. And she was saying, well, you have to do it. He was saying, Mom, I can't. He was so nervous. And all these years they were waiting to testify. Ellie stated that Daniel Driver was actually stalking her son. And at the courthouse, she said he was looking Willie up and down and smirking, which brings up that smile that Cassell mentioned. And this caused Willie to vomit. So things were not calm at all. Ellie's heart was racing. She told her sister, I'm going to get a gun. I'm going to kill him. And after court recess ended, before the judge was even returning to his station, Ellie grabbed the gun from Jan's purse in the courtroom hallway, walked calmly up to Driver, and fired 6 shots. 5 bullets landed in his head and neck, ending his life right away. The fatal shooting quickly plunged the tiny gold mining town of Jamestown into turmoil. Reporters poured in, tabloid TV shows pressed for details. Local supporters took up to Ellie's side, trying to defend her. One supporter named Donna Brewer, who owned a coffee shop next to the courthouse, said, Driver deserved what he got. That's the worst crime there is. However, the district attorney disagreed. He called the shooting in the courthouse reprehensible. Ellie was later bailed out on a $500,000 bond before her trial began. The public perception of Ellie Nesler at first was positive. I mean, people were quick to sympathize with a grief-stricken mother, a single mother who had been waiting so long for justice and who was fearful that it wouldn't arrive, that justice would never see the daylight for her son. She was a single mother, barely getting by and truly tormented by grief and rage. And many people felt like if they were in the same situation, they might have acted similarly. But her image as a grieving mother, blinded by the rage of seeing her son's abuser in court, deteriorated. People started to form split opinions when Ellie's blood test came back positive for methamphetamines, proving that she had been proving that she had been on methamphetamines during the shooting. People started to label her as an addict, a bad mother. So let's talk about the case, Ellie's trial, and how this all played a role. During the guilt phase of the trial, which is where the jury was to decide if Ellie is guilty or innocent, it was pretty hard to argue that she was innocent because, again, she had carried out the shooting in an open courtroom. There were several witnesses. Clearly, she was the person that unalived Driver, right? Something interesting that came up, though, was that before Ellie shot Driver, she asked an investigator in the courtroom if him and other employees in the DA's office would get in trouble if something bad happened to Driver. So the investigator didn't think much of it. He thought Ellie was referring to a past incident where another inmate attacked Driver. So he said no in response to her question. Later, after a court recess, Ellie returned to the courtroom alongside her sister Jan, and the prosecutor told them to take a seat. Driver was sitting in a chair approximately 1 foot from the defense counsel, and before the judge had returned to the courtroom, Ellie took out a gun from Jan's purse, holding it 2 to 3 feet from Driver's head, shooting him 5 times in the left side of his head and neck. The sixth bullet missed driver and was actually later found in the wall. Like, thank God it didn't hurt anybody else, right? But I'm assuming she has good aim because she grew up on a farm. Is that like not PC to say that? But anyway, Ellie was immediately taken into custody and interrogated. In the interview, she told investigators, "You don't understand. He," referring to a driver, "has raped hundreds of boys." The same day, in a tape recorded statement, she also stated she had not intended to kill driver at the hearing and did not know whether she had done the right thing, but was tired of it all. She was tired of the pain driver had caused and that he deserved to die. She genuinely believed that William's pain, her son's pain, had destroyed her sense of right and wrong. It's not William's pain. I mean, she's witnessing William's pain, but she's witnessing this monster. He's the one that destroyed her sense of right and wrong, right? In the taped statement, she denied ever using any drugs or alcohol that day. And obviously, we know now that she was on methamphetamines. After the tape recorder went off, however, she admitted that she had done crank, which I guess is another name for methamphetamines. Let me look that up. Crank. Crank dat. No, not the movie. There's a movie called Crank. Crank. Oh my God, am I really going to use Urban Dictionary right now? Crank. Okay, there's all kinds of words. Crunk, commence drinking, smoking, sniffing. Okay, I'm just going to assume crank is methamphetamines. Tell me if I'm wrong later. So in the taped statement, Ellie denied having used any drugs. We know that that's wrong now, or that's not true now. And she admitted that she had done crank once that morning after the tape recorder was turned off. While being transported to have blood samples taken, she once again admitted having taken methamphetamines that morning, but said she did not use it all the time. Oh my God. So she's in the back of the car being like, okay, I don't use any drugs or alcohol. I didn't use any that day. Well, okay, I did it once. Okay, I did it once that morning, but I'm really stressed out and I don't usually do it all the time. That's what I'm seeing. That's kind of painting a picture of. So the blood samples later revealed a concentration of the drug in her blood that might be seen in someone who has taken substantial doses during the previous 1 to 3 days. So either she has a really high tolerance or she was on a great deal of methamphetamines just that one day. The jury ended up finding her not guilty of first or second degree murder, but returned a verdict of guilty on a lesser included offense of voluntary manslaughter, and also found true an allegation that she had used a firearm in the commission of the offense. So yeah, she used a firearm. Obviously, they all witnessed that. And she was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter. So after this, the guilty phase of the trial came the sanity phase of the trial, where juries had to determine if Ellie was insane or not insane. And this is where things are not as open and shut. Things get a little bit more complicated here, and we'll get into it. The defense experts try to claim that Ellie was legally insane at the time of the shooting. So they wanted her to get off on pleading insanity at the time of the shooting. They stated that she suffered from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, rooted in her own history of SA. So this is interesting, and I couldn't find too much information on it, but I did find other articles where her doctor mentions that she had been SA'd as a child herself. So the defense claimed that due to her history of SA as a child and as a young woman, so she was SA'd multiple times in her life, that the trauma from her own PTSD had sent her into a brief reactive psychosis that led to the shooting. This psychosis made her believe that the authorities were aware of her plan to shoot driver and that that's what they wanted her to do. Which kind of brings us back to that question she asked the investigators if they'll be in trouble if anything happens to driver. Remember that during the guilty phase I mentioned it, and they didn't think anything of it. So it kind of aligns with the theory that she wanted to shoot driver because she thought she was doing something good for the world, that the investigators wanted her to shoot him. And ultimately, her PTSD made her confuse wrong from right was the argument. And just a quick note, I'm going to go off on a tangent here, but I briefly mentioned this in the Chelsea Perkins case about the mother and OF person, OnlyFans person, who unalived her abuser, Matthew Dunmeyer. But I wanted to quickly break down rape trauma syndrome, which I'll be referring to as RTS, because I think it's very pertinent to a lot of the cases I've covered. I have pulled up all this information from the Washington University, St. Louis, Missouri website about rape trauma syndrome. And I think it's not talked about enough, which is why I want to talk to you about it, because I think in a lot of cases that I'm interested in covering, this just keeps coming up. People don't analyze these crimes that involve carrying out revenge with the person's previous history of being essayed. And I think it's so important to talk about. So in rape trauma syndrome, which I'll be referring to as RTS, because I don't know if that word is allowed on YouTube. Okay, so RTS describes symptoms of trauma that manifest with signs and symptoms that disrupt your normal physical, emotional, cognitive, and interpersonal behavior. And major symptoms include re-experiencing the trauma, even though you're not in it. You can relive the trauma through nightmares, flashbacks. You can have an inability to stop remembering the event that took place. Even if it happened a decade ago, you can relive it through nightmares and flashbacks. And another symptom that's common is social withdrawal. This symptom has been called psychic numbing and involves not experiencing any emotions. Not you numb yourself to the world. You don't experience joy, you don't experience sadness, you're just numb. Then there's avoidant behavior. Survivors might avoid any feelings or thoughts that would remind them of the incident. Then there's increased physiological arousal characteristics. So that includes exaggerated startle responses, like somebody says hi to you and you jump like 10 feet because somebody from behind you like taps you on the shoulder and you're suddenly like thrown back to that time when you were essayed. Like it takes you there and you're hyper alert to the point where everything is like, oh, what's that? And you're freaking paranoid and your senses are so heightened. Also just manifest as not being able to sleep, like sleep disorders, because you're just constantly like thinking and aroused, not aroused like sexually, but your senses are constantly heightened. You're constantly reliving this fear of the attacker attacking you again, or a different attacker attacking you. And to the point where you can't sleep, you can't concentrate, maybe you can't eat or shower. And these things do happen in RTS, and every experience is different. But there are 5 major stages that people may cycle through, victims may cycle through. So for simplicity's sake, I will list it in this order, but it doesn't mean it affects you in this order, because people can go through these cycles throughout their lives, sadly. Like some people, it just never ends. Some people learn to live with it, but RTS can ultimately affect you for the rest of your life if you don't get help or if you don't understand what's happening to you. So number 1, there's an acute stage. The acute stage can begin days or weeks after an SA or an RAPE happen, and it can last anywhere from a few days to weeks. Symptoms might include hyper-alertness or diminished alertness, numbness, disorganized thought content, nausea, vomiting, paralyzing anxiety, confusion about everyday life, acute sensitivity to the reaction of other people, thoughts, and increased risk for unaliving yourself. Then there's the outward adjustment stage. It usually happens after the acute phase ends and can last anywhere from months to years if uninterrupted. And during this stage, survivors might look like they've moved on from an assault or essay, but that's just how it looks on the outside, because on the inside, there's serious turmoil and it manifests with a variety of different coping mechanisms. So you can think of the outward adjustment stage as the stage where the survivor or victim is trying to find how to cope. And these coping mechanisms can range from becoming more reliant on your family, anything from like exercising more or like wearing more conservative clothing, avoiding situations that you used to enjoy, like going out and dancing. Maybe your essay happened while with a person you met while you were dancing and you don't want to dance anymore because now that is a new coping mechanism because you feel like it'll give you control to prevent this essay from happening again. And some really unhealthy coping mechanisms that might develop are risky sexual activity, taking up drinking and drugs, and lifestyle changes can just really show up during this time. Then there's the underground stage. During this stage, victims and survivors have worked at getting back to their normal lives. So they can function going about their days with little to no disruption and then just kind of like learning to live life again. This is the underground stage. You might block thoughts of your abuser out of your mind or act like it never even happened, though, during the underground stage. And there still might be some tendencies for you to dissociate or to be hyper vigilant, but in general, you're functioning. Then there's the reorganization stage. So this is the stage, tell me what you think, that I think Ellie might have been at, because the reorganization stage is when you return from that underground stage where things were going normal to reliving it again. Something triggers you that suddenly brings back strong feelings about the essay and the assault that happened that you thought were resolved. Trigger can set you back and it's not resolved again. And during this time, people will be very fearful. They can have nightmares, violent fantasies and revenge, increased thoughts of unaliving oneself or being dangerous, like acting out violently. I'm not a psychiatrist again, but I think this kind of rings true for Ellie Nesler because, again, she has a history of SA as a child and an adult. So she's already at risk of having RTS. She had been raising her children fine, but this incident with Willie, I think, was a huge trigger for her. I think the courtroom was another huge trigger for her. I think that seeing Daniel Driver's smirk just was the nail in the coffin. She lunged into her violent fantasies. She became a risk to others, and she carried out this action. Like, she might have been fantasizing about unaliving Driver for a while as she was triggered and went back into her reorganization phase. And then there's the last phase, which is just the renormalization stage. And this is when the essay or the incident that happened is no longer your main focus in your life. You're able to live normally, and hopefully this is like a time when you don't go back into a cycle, because this is like the best phase you can be in. The renormalization stage is when you've figured out your coping mechanisms, you can identify what your unhealthy coping mechanisms are, and you can kind of look outside of yourself and say, hey, I've been through these cycles before. This didn't work out. This worked out. This is what I do to calm myself. That's the renormalization stage, where you've figured out your healthy coping mechanisms. You've reintegrated to a normal life again, and you look back at SA with sadness, but it doesn't make you take up your whole day. So that was a long tangent. Let's go back to the trial. We've gone past the guilty phase. We're now at the sanity phase of Ellie's trial. Her defense team argued that she was insane during the time of the shooting due to PTSD. Then Ellie's history of drug use came up, specifically her use of methamphetamines. While some people believe that her use of methamphetamines shouldn't be used to determine her mental state, others beg to differ. So psychologist Philip Trumpeter diagnosed Ellie at the hearing as suffering from amphetamine intoxication and psychoactive substance abuse at the time of the shooting. Trumpeter testified that Ellie told him that she was using methamphetamines in the fall of 1992 and used it on approximately 20 occasions, the last two of which were the night before the preliminary hearing and the morning of the hearing. Not the best time to use it, but at this point, you're probably a little bit addicted, Ellie. This woman has been through so much, and I'm not trying to shame her. Ellie had told him, Trumpeter, the doctor, the psychologist, that the shooting never would have happened had she not had the drug in her system, because it caused her to have a false sense of reality and to do things she ordinarily wouldn't have done. However, during the cross-examination, Dr. Trumpeter testified. So while the prosecution cross-examined him, he testified that he had received information from the Department of Justice that others had reportedly seen the defendant, Ellie, snort crank in 1989, as well as some other information about drug sales. So there was a lot of talk about Ellie potentially being a drug seller. However, ultimately, the judge granted the defense the motion to strike out all the reference to drug sales, and they instructed the jury as well to disregard that information because it was based on hearsay. And even if it was true, they said it was irrelevant to any issue that the court or the jury had to decide. So in making his diagnosis of PTSD, Dr. Trumpeter stated Ellie had become protective of others, hypervigilant for the safety of her own children, especially when it came to protecting Willie from abuse. He stated she would usually not have babysitters and would have a family member babysit the kids. I think she was very concerned that these children could be abused despite her protective efforts. Willie was profoundly violated. This in itself became a secondary traumatic stress for her, and I believe the most significant stress for her. I think she started to feel the guilt of failing to protect her son, and I think that just re-aroused all kinds of feelings towards her parents and related to her own molestation. Violent fantasies. But moving on, he was cross-examined. Dr. Trumpeter was cross-examined once again by the prosecution, and it was revealed that Ellie had once told him that she considered putting Willie in foster home system, and that she went through a period of time where she hated Willie. Obviously, this paints Ellie in a negative light, and I just feel for her because I'm assuming everybody was just like, oh, she's such a bad mother. But I think that's also just a trauma-related response to have those thoughts. Like sometimes you have intrusive thoughts and you can't like shake them. And the only person you can talk to is a professional psychiatrist, but then it's presented to the whole courtroom and used against you by the prosecution. So, man, it's just tough because I can only imagine the rush of feelings and emotions she's feeling, like, oh, I wasn't a good enough mother. I couldn't handle him. Maybe he would do better in the foster care system. But then again, it's like we've all heard stories about the foster care system and children getting essayed in the foster care system. According to Dr. Trumpeter, the combination of Ellie's mental disorders, drug use, and the circumstances existing on the day of the hearing made it impossible for her to discern whether the act of killing Driver was morally right or wrong. And he also tried to elaborate that Ellie considered placing Willie in a foster home because of how protective and concerned she was, and reiterated that she generally did not like having babysitters because she wanted to be with her kids all the time. And maybe that related to her own history with abuse. However, Dr. Trumpeter wasn't the only psychiatrist who would testify. Dr. Rhys Jones, a psychiatrist specializing in psychopharmacology, also presented his opinion on Ellie's mental state at the time of the shooting. And he stated that to determine if she was in some sort of psychosis, he would need to know whether her blood level was produced by one dose of methamphetamines or it was produced by a dosage of methamphetamines over the course of several weeks, months, or years. Meaning it depended on her tolerance level, because a person who is not used to taking methamphetamines with blood levels similar to Ellie's would typically go into a psychotic state had they had those blood levels. In the end, however, he concluded that the effect that the drugs had on her were not that wild. He said he didn't find her behavior to be reflective of somebody in a psychotic or delusional state, and that she was cognitively aware and oriented at the time that she took Driver's life. Interesting. So following the evidence presented at the sanity phase of the trial, the jury was instructed to not use any testimonies that were motioned to be not used. Like, for example, the one about her potentially being a drug dealer. They couldn't use that information because the motion had been granted to throw that testimony out, that part of the testimony out. And the jury was told, if a mental illness is manifested in delusions which render the individual incapable either of knowing the nature and character of her act, of understanding that is wrong, she is legally insane. So ultimately, it was ruled that she was sane at the time of the shooting. However, the trial would take another turn that would ultimately impact Ellie's time served in prison, because it was later revealed that one of the jurors, by the name of Catherine Elizabeth Bourget, and get ready, you guys, because this girl is a lot. And this part is crazy, okay? So there's this woman who's one of the jurors by the name of Catherine Elizabeth Bourget. And she began sharing information about Ellie that she had attained from Ellie's babysitter. So she was saying she personally knew Ellie's children's babysitter, and that the babysitter said Ellie would frequently leave her children unattended and was not a good mother. And Bourget would frequently refer to Ellie as a crankster, which is, again, in reference to her using methamphetamines, saying she didn't love her children. Someone who loves her children doesn't use drugs. Bourget eventually had the audacity to share that she herself had ingested methamphetamines in the past and can tell when someone has done so, and that Ellie presented with all the signs. So that's just like weird. It's like you're a drug user and you're crapping on other drug users. And she eventually stated that Ellie's friends frequently go to restaurants where Bourget works as a waitress, and she said that her friends are illicit drug users and Ellie sells drugs. And again, this was one of the things that the defense had successfully had the court strike out of the testimonies. They were saying that whether or not Ellie uses drugs is not relevant to whether she's insane or sane during the time of the shooting. So luckily, another juror by the name of Mary Olvivadit told the court that during deliberation, Bourget was in a room of jurors constantly bad-mouthing Ellie, bringing up their personal biases, and that this person was really just not fit to be one of the jurors because she had a personal grief with Ellie. It seemed that she was too involved in Ellie's world. She knew the babysitter. She worked at the restaurant where Ellie's friends would frequent. She herself was a drug user and had very strong opinions and biases against other people that have dabbled with drugs. Or other people that have used drugs. I guess in Ellie's case, maybe she didn't dabble. Maybe she had a whole history of addiction, but she just wasn't the right juror for this case. And to make this more annoying, Bourget was bringing these comments up at least once a day while the jury was deliberating, especially during the sanity phase. So I can only imagine how frustrating that is if you're trying to be an ethical juror, you're trying to be unbiased, and you have one person just in your ear all the time telling you their own opinions about this person being a bad mother, being a drug addict, and blah, 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 blah. So in 1994, Ellie was ultimately charged with voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years in prison. In 1995, a year prior to her release, this case, again, it was huge. This was the case that everyone talked about in the 90s in America. So Ellie and her children were actually invited to be on the set of Oprah. So her children would be on the set of Oprah while Ellie would be interviewed in real time through a screen that was from her prison cell. And she shared at the time that she had mixed feelings about unaliving Daniel, saying, "I'm sorry I killed someone and that I'm not with my children. But on the other hand, I wish the judicial system would have taken care of it. I wish I didn't have to. I didn't want other people to know what happened to Willie. I didn't think he should have to face this man face to face. They were traumatizing my child. These children should not have to face the man that molested them." And in response to Ellie, Oprah herself said that she didn't think Ellie should have gone to prison. Oprah said, "We all know it's wrong to kill a person in this country, and I'm certainly not advocating that anybody should, but I think it is just one of the greatest miscarriages of justice that you are behind bars right now." She says, "Something is very wrong. Aren't you angry about that?" Which I thought the last part of that was dumb. Like, yes, of course she's angry, Oprah. She's in jail. Of course she's not with her kids. What the hell, Oprah? But yeah, it was such a big case that even Oprah like voiced her opinion. And Willie also spoke on the show stating he didn't regret telling his mother about the molestation, but it's bittersweet. He said, "In a way, I'm glad I did," referring to telling his mom, "because now he can't hurt any more kids and I don't have to worry about him hurting me. On the other hand, I lost my mom. And Ellie's daughter, we barely like hear about her, but she was also on the couch sitting next to her brother Willie on the set of Oprah and said, "A long time ago, my mom told me my brother was in so much pain that he was going to unalive himself, and that hurt me a lot. Everybody else loves me, but my mom and my brother love me most." And he's just so young, and it's just so heartbreaking that it just goes to show you how this whole generation was impacted by this one scumbag piece of shit driver. I don't want to say his name again. So Ellie confirmed this, that on the Oprah show, that over a year and a half ago, when William was just 11 or 12, she had to take a gun out of his hands. She said he wanted to unalive himself. He didn't want anyone to know what happened. Now the whole world knows, and Willie's brave enough to stand up. Oh, so sad. And after only serving 3.5 years in Northern California Women's Facility in Stockton, 3.5 years of her 10-year sentence, she was released in 1997. And it all goes back to that juror misconduct because Boje had been blasting her mouth during the sanity phase of the trial to all the other jurors. And they somehow reduced her sentence by 7 years, which is crazy. But yeah, I think there were very mixed feelings about her early release, as you'll see. And I wish I could say this is where the family reunites and that Ellie and Rebecca get to pick up the pieces and mend the broken pieces of their family being torn apart by this scumbag driver. But this actually doesn't have a happy ending because while Ellie was serving time, her children were struggling. Her family was struggling again. Like they had to pay a $500,000 bail. They had to pay attorney fees. They had to pay all of this. And her sisters had to step in and her mother, Marie Starr, had to step in. Between the two of them, Jan Martinez and Marietta Adams, they had 10 children of their own. Jan had 7 kids. Marietta had 3. I believe Jan's husband had already passed before the shooting even occurred. And now they had Rebecca and Willie. That's 12 kids. So they were struggling. And in interviews, they would say they're doing the best they can, but the children really need their mother. 2 months before her sentencing, though, Ellie was diagnosed with inflammatory breast cancer, which is a rare form of cancer. Doctors were unable to remove her breast because the cancer had already spread to her lymph nodes and throughout her body while she was in prison. At her current stage, Ellie said, "There's a 50% chance that I'll ever see 5 years. I've made it a year now." Bad, but she said, "We'll have 6 months to prepare." She thought she was basically going to die when she got released from prison. After her release, like I said, things were getting a lot harder. Ellie faced further legal issues. In 2002, she actually was convicted of drug possession. According to a search warrant affidavit, an informant told Tulum narcotic team investigators that Ellie was using and selling methamphetamines and also planned to buy pseudoephedrine so she could manufacture methamphetamines with it. For those of you who don't know, pseudoephedrine is usually used for allergies to fight congestion, the common cold, and she was going to use it to make meth. On October 3rd, the same informant carried a concealed tape. It was something the investigators arranged for him to do. And during this time, Ellie purchased 10,000 pseudoephedrine pills from him. And Ellie also was talking to him and babbling about something and gave him 0.06 grams of methamphetamines. After the exchange was made, Ellie was arrested and booked into jail. She was sentenced to 6 years after this, but released from a women's correctional prison in 4 years. So in 2008, just 2 years after her release, Ellie died of breast cancer. in 2008 at the age of 56. She had been battling breast cancer for 14 years. And I think that what's so sad is that Willie was actually in prison when Ellie passed. He had to say goodbye to her, okay, from a phone in the prison because he had been sentenced to 25 years in life for murder. And this is where I want to talk about the impact that trauma plays on families. And it's not just Ellie's fault. All of this is absolutely Daniel Mark Driver's piece of shit fault. Like, he ruined lives with what he did, and it carried this cascade because Ellie, she was already addicted to meth, but who knows like what role that played with her having difficulty readjusting to society when she came out of prison. And then her children suffered while she was in prison because they didn't have their mother. They already have an absent father. They're trying to survive among their huge family of cousins. And as an adult, William's living situation was rough, and it shows that his mental state was really declining, if you ask me, because he lived on a garbage-strewn street, 1 acre plot of land, completely covered in garbage, and he was cited for numerous code violations for a collection of trailers in which people were illegally living. Stuff was just thrown everywhere. It just makes me think of when you're going down like Skid Row in Los Angeles, that street that's just full of trailer cars and homeless people. And that was kind of the situation I imagine that he was living in, but it was on 1 acre plot of land closer to Sacramento. So on June 24th, 2004, police were called to a 1 acre land surrounded by barbed wire after a man named David Davis complained that Willie, who was 23 years old at the time, had stolen his tools. Willie reportedly charged at him, kicking and beating him. At the age of 23 years old, William was arrested for beating his neighbor, David Davis, in a fight over some tools. David was a 45-year-old man Willie had hired to clean up his property and was living in a shack on Willie's lot. Willie's mom, Rita Brown, said that her son was disabled from years of working in oil fields in Wyoming. So this was just his way of getting by. So after that incident on June 24th, when the cops were called to break up this fight by David Davis had reported, Willie was sentenced to 60 days in jail for battery, and he only served 32 days because at the time people were trying to alleviate crowding in the prison system. The sentence also included a restraining order that Willie would have to stay 100 yards away from Davis. Willie clearly hadn't learned his lesson though, and he didn't follow that restraining order because on 4 a.m. on July 25th, 2004, within 1 hour of his release, Willie went back and did the same exact thing, starting a fight with David Davis, except this time, David was found by officers unconscious, lying in a pool of his own blood, unresponsive. Davis was taken to a hospital in Modesto, but it was too late. He was ultimately taken off of life support the next day and pronounced dead. And this was all because Willie had attacked him. The cause and manner of death was found to be massive head wounds by homicide. David's mother stated a warrant for Willie's arrest was issued, and Willie actually ran for a while. So not only did he murder a man, he became a fugitive for a minute. He was ultimately found and arrested and is currently serving a lifelong long-term prison sentence in California. And it's not looking good, at least not to me, because he's received additional prison time since his sentence for multiple things. He was convicted for drug possession in 2013. Then he was convicted for assault with a deadly weapon in 2019. And as of last year, May 2025, he's been accused of possibly being involved in a prison killing. Davis's mother said she was appalled when she went there to collect her son's belongings after her son was removed from life support at Modesto Hospital, saying it's a horrible piece of property. His friends said you should have seen it before David started cleaning. She said her son's remains would be cremated and his ashes would be scattered in the two places he loved most, off the coast of Santa Barbara, where he scuba dived, and near the mountains of Calaveras Big Tree State Park. She said she never met Willie Nesler, but remembered sympathizing with him after his mother's act of revenge. But now that her son is dead, that sentiment is gone. He needs to be in jail for the rest of his life. He is obviously very disturbed and very dangerous. And that is where the story sadly ends. I couldn't find too much on William's sister, Rebecca. It seems she's still alive, but she's been out of the news. Marietta once said, "When Ellie was sentenced, we were all sentenced, but her children were punished the most. To have their mother taken, we've tried to be there for each other, but we've been struggling. So that is the story of Ellie Nesler, the vigilante courthouse mother. What do you think of this story? Let me know in the comment section below. And thank you so much for listening. This is ShadeCore, and until next week.